Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session with Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to Ariel. He is a professor at Stanford University in the Department of Religious Studies. He's also a fellow and a colleague at the Hartman Institute of North America. Ariel's interests include the role of language in Hasidism, manuscript theory, the formation of early Hasidic literature, the renaissance of Jewish mysticism in the 19th and 20th century, and really on point for our talk tonight, the resources of Jewish thought and theology for constructing contemporary environmental ethics. Ariel has written some really important works, and the subject of his talk tonight is actually making its way into a book. It's called As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology, and Environmental Ethics, and that's under contract with Brandeis University Press. On a personal level, I've known Ariel for a long time, and what is so striking to me about Ariel is that he is a stellar scholar, one of the, I don't want to embarrass him, but he is one of the top in his field. And yet at the same time, his passion is really manifest, that sometimes academics and scholars are critiqued for living in these ivory towers and from being removed from the rest of the world and the concerns of the world and the crises of the world. And Ariel is not like that. And he's also a wonderful human being and a mensch. And I will just put this out there that if people have questions or they want to follow up from tonight's talk, I am confident that Ariel would welcome those questions and comments and follow up. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Ariel, and welcome again to the Hebrew Institute of White Plains. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really wonderful to be here virtually and to sit tonight together with you and to think together about these issues of mutual concern. Sarah, we've been friends and I've been your admirer for a very long time, so it's wonderful to have this opportunity. I'm grateful to the wonderful clergy of the Hebrew Institute of White Plains for this invitation, and to you all for showing up and for giving me some time this evening. I hope it will be worth your while. My own background is not irrelevant to this topic. I am, in a certain sense, a native son of California. I grew up in Fresno, which most people on the East Coast have never heard of unless you drove through it on the way to Yosemite. But I grew up in a world surrounded by agriculture. My parents were both involved in the sustainable agriculture movement before it was cool. And I grew up on a small farm in the middle of a city, or really within a county island in the middle of what then became one enormous suburb. My own religious experiences were deeply formed by growing up so close to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And when I think about some of my first memories and my first encounters with the divine, it is in that space of those sacred rocks and those sacred trees that I first began to find my Jewish language. So this evening, I'd like to invite you on a journey through the sources that I'm considering, that I'm grappling with, in order to understand our current moment and what it is that God wants from us. I'm hoping that this will be a conversation, not a lecture, and I'm hoping that you'll join me in investing deeply. We live in a strange and difficult time. Not news to anyone, right? Of course, I mean COVID, but I also mean something more. We live in a time of profound environmental consequence and reckoning. It's manifest in weather events, increasingly extreme, loss of biodiversity, depletion of fisheries, prolonged droughts like the one we're having here in California, mass extinctions on a scale never before seen, and systemic pollution of air, water, and soil. This amounts to a crisis, and it should prompt us to rethink our work. In a certain sense, I think that theology begins with the world. It begins by an encounter with the world around us. I think that religion has something very, very important to add to contemporary environmental thinking. Has anyone here read Lynn White's famous indictment of the religious causes of the environmental crisis? It's something he wrote in the 1960s. It was published in Science. It's been footnoted a few thousand times. It's kind of the quintessential cornerstone of religious environmental ethics. And there he went on the attack and said, it's all religion's fault. That's somewhat of an overstatement, although he's not entirely wrong. Since then, religion, Judaism included, has responded in a couple ways. One of them is greenwashing, either applying a veneer to the Jewish tradition or something else and saying, look, we really do care about this, or saying, well, we were actually the green religion all along, back into antiquity, which is a hard argument for any religion to make as long as it's a religion of people. Or the other approach, which is the analogic approach, which is, how do I say in Jewish what the New York Times tells me I need to care about? Oh, tikkun olam, I know about that. Fixing the world, that's great. Stewardship, okay, how do you say that in Jewish? These are important things, but I hope that religion has something more to add to the table than just shoring up pre-existent categories. The first step, as I said, to theology is not to rush to solutions, but to recognize, to train our eyes on the worlds around us and to train our eyes upon the horizon. So I'm here going to share my screen, hoping that everyone can see the sources in front of you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. So where do we turn? Judaism is well schooled in questions of destruction, in questions of calamity, and in questions of crisis. I've chosen two verses that I find to be particularly repercussive. One from the book of Jeremiah immediately before the destruction of the temple, one from the book of Lamentations amid the destruction of the temple. The first, as you see, is Jeremiah telling the people, do not claim as follows. These buildings are the temple of God. They are the temple of God. They are the temple of God. The implication being, God will never destroy God's house. Jeremiah castigates the people and says, don't think that just because it has a divine address, it means that you can withstand the force that is coming. The second verse I find particularly important because it allows us to rethink what it means to live amid crisis. Odenu tichlena einenu el ezratenu havel, v'tzipiatenu tzipinu el goy lo yoshea. Even now, our eyes pine away in vain for deliverance. I think about this, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, every time I get some email from Stanford about a new technology that will deliver us from all issues around the climate crisis. Okay. The next source comes from the Maimonides' introduction to the Mishneh Torah, to the section of dealing with fast days. Fasting obviously has many different isotopes in the Jewish tradition. One of the most important ones is not only Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av, but is the fasting of what happens when you don't have enough rain. And when Maimonides opens the Mishneh Torah in any particular section, he tries to drive home what the moral, theological implications of that section of the mitzvot are going to be. So when it comes to fasting, he says as follows, that when a community cries out in prayer and sounds the alarm, everyone realizes that misfortune has come upon them because of their misdeeds. Biglal ma'asehem haraim. That is to say, when the lights go off and the siren sounds, people begin to pay attention. But it's not just paying attention to the circumstances, that's important. It is also paying attention to the fact that you have responsibility, obligation, founded in that awareness and introspection. And I think that's key. Alarm is one thing. Alarm that leads not to paralysis, but to a sense of understanding, to a sense of accounting and reckoning, and to a sense of growth is going to be the key. And that's a through line through everything that we're going to work on tonight. One of my favorite scholars of environmental studies, his name is Kyle White. He teaches at the University of Michigan. He's an indigenous activist as well as a philosopher and an earth scientist, describes two different ways of thinking. One of them is the epistemology of crisis. He describes the epistemology of crisis as anyone who has ever been in a fight with another human being knows, when you're in a fight, when you're in a crisis, you double down on the things that you know. Not necessarily the things that are good for you, but the things that you know. And so what Kyle White means in this context is that the rhetoric of crisis can actually be problematic because you're going to double down on the things that you think you know. If technology has gotten us to this place, we got to go more and more, and we'll grow and we'll grow, and it'll be bigger and bigger. White describes an alternative to that, which is an epistemology of coordination. An epistemology of coordination, which is not, oh my gosh, this is an unprecedented event, I have no place in my brain to file this away, but rather thinking of according to the longue durée of time that has gone across eons. What do I need to get through this? And that's connection to other people and connection to the world around me. It's nice of you also to host my children. I'm sure you can hear them in the background. We haven't yet instilled in them that dinner time is supposed to be an epistemology of coordination as opposed to an epistemology of crisis, but I'm sure they're going to get there. As I said, I live in the middle of the of Silicon Valley, and much of what we think about here is in terms of technology. There's always got to be a response to something in terms of technology. There's this philosophical position called technological determinism, which is the values of a society should be shaped by their capabilities. It's a terrifying prospect as things get more and more and more possible. And I think that one of the things that Judaism brings to the table in a very profound way is that not everything that can be done ought to be done. When it comes to technology, there's obviously things around that having to do with privacy. There are things around this having to do with medical ethics, and there are certainly things about the way that technology can both become a phantom siren song of providing a solution, as well as one of the, shall we say, engines driving the problem. This is one of my favorite midrashim. I think about it a lot these days, in which the Baalei Midrash, the rabbis, imagine the people of the flood and the people of the generation who built the tower. Both of these stories in Genesis, they're connected in the midrashic imagination, as watching the skies begin to open up. And they look at it and they say, oh my gosh, once every big number, things fall apart. So let's prop it up. Let's prop open the skies. Let's build supports to make sure that nothing comes down. So we'll build a tower in the north, a tower in the south, a tower in the west, and here the Tower of Babel will stand in the east. Obviously, we read that story, the Tower of Babel, as one about hubris, of human beings thinking that they can climb into the sky. Here's a different understanding that keeps that notion of hubris. Can we really stop something like that? Can we really stop the wildfires? Can we really stop the processes that have been set into motion? Another source that I often come to on this particular question around technology is it's a great source from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is the son of the Chacham Tzvi. He's an 18th century rabbi who is best known for lots of things. He was an inveterate heresy hunter who tried to kick the Sabbateans out of the Jewish fold, and then the Frankists out of the Jewish fold, accusing them of being worse than the Christians because they weren't just another religion, they were not any religion. He was also a very interesting human being who thought a lot about Kabbalah, and he and his father give us some of the most outright declarations of how to build and deal with a golem. They're great for thinking about technology. I like to think about robots. That's one of my other things that I like to consider. So in one of the Tshuvot, one of the responsive from the Chacham Tzvi, from Rabbi Yaakov Emden's father, he describes whether or not a robot can count in a minyan and all sorts of questions around this. which are great. And Yaakov Emden sort of piggybacks on that, and he gives us this amazing story about his grandfather, who is the one who built the golem, as it were, who grows afraid when he sees it getting bigger and bigger. This is before the reinvention of the golem story and the Maharal of Prague, which all get squished together somewhat later. But this ancient Central European rabbi from the 16th century 17th century, looks at the golem getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he tries to extinguish it. He tries to destroy it. He scrapes off the name of God that animates it. Okay, great. The kicker of the story is that he is struck back by the golem. When he takes the name off of the golem's head, the golem strikes him back. I take this to mean that our interactions with technology are not one way. We are shaped by, and in some ways, and in some cases, damaged by those deeds. Okay. It's not enough to think in theological categories or in legal categories. In order to think deeply about the climate crisis, we also need to be thinking poetically. Does anyone here have any experience reading the poetry of Zelda Mishkovsky? So Zelda Mishkovsky, an amazing poet in her own right. Her maiden name was Schneerson, which probably sounds familiar to many people in New York. She's the first cousin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they exchanged letters, and they, I think, had a fairly warm relationship. Zelda moved with her family to Israel from Ukraine and spent the rest of her life there. She was Amos Oz's grade school teacher, amongst many other things. And she was also one of the pioneers of Hebrew poetry in the generations after Bialik. She was a truly extraordinary poet whose works took the Israeli world of letters by storm, both secular and to a much lesser degree, the religious poets, because there were very few. So she existed in these multiple worlds. Anyway, I could talk about her all night. I happen to love her. One of the things that is so characteristic of her poetry is her ability to celebrate the profound miracle of the ordinary. The stories of her poetry, the heroes of her poetry are fish, butterflies, plants. Marcia Falk, from whose translation I've taken this and whose book of Zelda's poems in translation and in the Hebrew original, I commend to everyone. Marcia Falk, in the introduction to that, tells a story about when she was sent to ask Zelda about a goldfish in one of her poems. What does it represent? And Zelda evidently told her, why is everyone always searching for what this is a symbol for? And then she paused and she looked at a houseplant, and she told Marcia, is a houseplant that cannot speak any less miraculous than one that can? The resplendence, that's a word she uses. Noga and Zohar are words that are very important for her. The resplendence of the ordinary is something that is key, but also the fragility of life. She lost everyone that she was close to at a very early age. Mortality was something that she confronted, but she also understood what happens when human beings turn their forces of destruction upon the world around them. Here, you have a story, a poem, about these strange, shadowy figures who emerge from the ruins, destroying trees, whose majesty becomes interrupted, and then it ends. This is a poem that highlights not only the power of the landscape, but the interiority of the tree. Hold on to that. Pnimiyut hatzmicha, the interior flourishing of that tree. I want you to hold on to that, because when we meet a tree a little bit later, we're going to come back to this. These trees are not cut down gently. they're destroyed wantonly. They're kicked to the side. Le'ashpot. Hishlichu le'ashpot. Ashpa is a modern Hebrew word. It's a fine word. It's also anyone who sat at Shara Ashpot, at the seat of the temple, knows that it's also a symbol for destruction. One gets the sense from Zelda's poem that she is calling our attention to the fact that chopping down a tree can mean very different things. And at times, it can be murder. If you look at the frontispiece that she puts, the epigram here, there's this starry-eyed child who says, "Since when are you allowed to kill trees?" And the word that she uses there, laharog eitzim, it's a word you can't use together, right? You can't horeg an etz. You can chop down a tree, you can do lots of things, but you can't murder it, not in normal Hebrew. One of the things that Amos Oz says about Zelda is that she puts together words that don't go together, and then it pops. That's kind of the word he uses, that the language pops off the page. And I think it's all the more so true. So here's an invitation to think about what happens when the snows of our stable world begin to melt. Must more devastation emerge? Or could something else be possible? Okay. I'm going to invite you to look at this one on your own. All these sources will be made available to you, Sarah. I'm sure that we can do that. Okay, great. And I hope that you'll walk with them and think about them and learn them with people that you care about and love. This is a story from the Me'orei Naim, from a great Hasidic master from the 18th century, which essentially gives the following message. Why does Joseph, why do the brothers, why do the bands of Israel go down into Mitzrayim? Not because it was a place of food, shever, but because it was a place of shvira, brokenness. It takes tremendous courage to go down into the place of brokenness. But ultimately, says the Me'orei Naim, ultimately, says Kabbalah, ultimately, I would say one of the great answers of our tradition is that from fracture, from that which is broken, the tikkun, the healing, the being set right can happen. So much of what I've said now up until this point is diagnostic. It's trying to give us a vocabulary for thinking about the world in eyes that are, I would say, not sanguine, but also not afraid, growing able to sense what is transpiring around us. So I'm hoping that your question is, great. So now what do we do? And there are going to be feet on the ground versions of answers to that question, and there will be other answers as well. In order to rethink this moment, I think we also need new myths. We need new stories. Many people quote this in the name of various people, that restoration is about restoration. It's about creating new narratives. I would say, rather than creating new ones, I'd look for what the Zohar calls milin atikin chadatin, new old words. That which is new and that which is old at the same time. Because, as anyone who plays music knows, a score means one thing. But once it's brought to life by a conductor, by a particular orchestra at a particular moment, it looks like something totally different. One answer to begin thinking through this question comes to us from the world of Hasidism. Hasidism can be very easily reduced to a single theological principle, and then we can argue about what it looks like. And that's as follows, and this isn't my innovation, this is something that a Hasidic author writes from one person to another in the tail end of the 18th century. And evidently it was hard enough to say it in Hebrew that he said it in Yiddish. It's in the middle of a letter in Hebrew. And he says as follows: the great principle in Chassidut is als is Gott. Everything is God. Here's a great declaration of that. God is everything, creates anew in all moments, breathing existence into being once more. If we take this theological principle seriously, then we live in a world that shimmers with divinity. We live in a world from which God's overt presence has been hidden, but there is a trace of that divine in every aspect of the world that surrounds us. In other words, we are not divorced from or apart from nature. We are a part of that world. We are a part of the economy of life and breath and sacred vitality. There's a good word for that. It's ecology, the economy of life. We are a part of that. Now, I would ask you, how do we create from that a toothsome ethic? If religious texts are also often being accused of being toothless, I want to find something toothsome, like good al dente paste. One answer that you find is Mary J. Rubinstein in her book on pantheism and theology and environmental ethics says we need to beam nature better, which I think is good. It's a good start of an answer. But I think one of the dimensions that Judaism brings to the table is going to be that it gives so much more richness and texture to that claim. Another vision that you find from within the world of Jewish mystical sources is that, well, there's the story of the Garden of Eden, amazing, wonderful. There's also the story of the garden of our world, a garden from which we have not been cast out, a garden in which we exist as actors, as gardeners, and as participants. The Zohar loves to read the verse, a river goes out from Eden, Anahar Yotze Me Eden. And if you think about it grammatically, Yotze is not in the past tense. The river goes out from Eden, not in the past tense, but in the present tense. And flipping it in the other direction, the Zohar always, not always, mostly reads the words Olam Haba, Alma Da'ate, world to come, not as the world that will be, but the world that is always coming. Alma Da'ate Tadir, the world that is always coming. If, says the Zohar, we live in a world in which our actions allow the well springs to continue flowing, for the garden to continue flourishing, for the plants to continue to grow, that's its metaphor for the Sfirot amongst many other things, then we live not in some venerated past, but in a present that is like the time to come. And yet, if the water doesn't, this water, which is light, which is energy, which is vitality, ceases to flow, then we live in a world that is increasingly bereft, not only of divine blessing, but of the stable yet dynamic biodiversity and landscapes that embody that divinity. So human beings in that story are part of the garden. It's not everything is God, although at the end of the day, the Zohar will kind of say that too, but the Zohar speaks in the world of myth. It shows us that we are part of that bigger story. In both of these sources, both in the Hasidic and in the Zoharic source, I think we see the possibility of a world that shimmers with divinity. Here, I would commend to you the work of the anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who I almost fainted when I saw this the first time, describes this amazing concept from the Yungu Aboriginal community of Northern Australia. She studied them for many, many years. It's called Biryun. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've never heard it spoken, but it means brilliance or shimmering. And what she means by that, what they mean by that, is that it is a kind of brilliance that allows you, and this is a quote, or brings you into the experience of being part of a vibrant and vibrating world. I couldn't think of a better summary of what the Zohar beckons us to do. Now, here's the kicker. Brilliance in this community also means one's capacity to see and experience ancestral power. Note, at the end of the Zoharic passage in front of you, what the rabbis do. There's one place that nothing interesting happens in the Zohar, and that's the Beit Midrash. The Beit Midrash, the house of study, is a boring place. It's just books. The world is the place that the Zohar takes as its text. The Chevraya, these strange friends, wander around what they imagine to be the Galilee, the Galil, and they have all sorts of crazy adventures with donkey drivers and wells and mountains and rivers and the landscape, which is the landscape of the Hebrew Bible and the landscape of the Song of Songs and the landscape of their own theological world. They'll arrive at a river and say, look, it's the river that goes out of Eden. And then they'll sit down and have what my teacher, Melila Hellner-Esche, describes as a jazz session, where each one of them will put forward a new variation on that verse. Here's just one example where they reach a certain place and they say, Amar Rabbi Abba, ha tzechota demile de oraita. Here is clarity for words of Torah. That's how Daniel Matt has translated it. Tzachot means a lot more than clarity. Tzachot in the medieval world means eloquence. It means brilliance. It means luminosity. It means something that sparkles. So clarity, not in the sense of, oh, yeah, intellectually, I figured it out, but it means a tree that sparkles and comes to life. It's contained not in a book. You could imagine another version of this, which would be, and I opened up the, I don't know, the Gemara or something like that. Here they arrive at a tree and they say that the landscape is brilliant. It teaches us something. And then, Netev, they sit, and he patach ve'amar. He begins to speak. Okay. I'm going to pause for just a second. Let me know if you have any questions. Sarah, maybe you can help us field those questions. Type them into the chat, which I can't really see because I'm trying to concentrate on you and the sources and my crazy making children.
I forgot to announce that everybody should feel free to either put questions into the chat or to private chat them to me, and I can bring them to the group. Ariel, one question that I had was back to the Rambam's text and the question around fault or guilt when there is catastrophe around. And I think that the way that you presented it is that the catastrophe or calamity is a trigger to be introspective, but it also seems to be in the Rambam that there's an indication of people having done something wrong. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, in the current in the environment that we're living in now, what role does that play? Is it necessary to turn to guilt and to a mode of beating ourselves up? Is that necessary? Can we parse that more? Can we create a taxonomy of that? Maybe collective guilt, individual guilt. I don't know. I'm struggling with that, so I wanted to put that out there.
Look, we don't live in a medieval world in which there's a one-to-one correspondence between our actions and God's retribution. I'm very thankful for that. On the other hand, probably if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, no, I'm not sure about that answer anymore. As I look at myself in the mirror and think about the world that I'm bequeathing to my children, Heschel's quote, which is often bandied about to the point of absurdity, that in a free society, some are guilty and all are responsible. I'm a vegetarian. I try to make good decisions about what I do and how my quote unquote carbon footprint is. And yet I belong to a research university that projects power in all sorts of ways across the universe. And I'm complicit in all of these systems and I am shaped by them. I do think that on the one hand, staying in that place, or assuming a simplistic one-to-one correspondence, or what many of the, I would say, many of the agents that drive climate change have tried to turn it into an individual struggle. I mean, our sort of modern mindset of the great novel, which is about the individual moral adventure, has primed us for thinking about these terms. So one of the exercises I do with my Stanford students is that in my religion and ecology class, they take the carbon foot calculator, and then they have to make ethical decisions based on things that they've learned. They usually really enjoy that, and then are troubled when they realize that the carbon footprint calculators, many of them were first generated by oil companies as a way of redistributing blame. I don't think that blame is particularly helpful. I'm a student of Chassidut. You focus on the positive, not the negative. On the other hand, if you're not willing to do the work of look around you and with a shofar in hand to say that we collectively and responsibly have entered a moment of reckoning that requires a righting of the ways, that I think is the more important message from the Rambam, which is that he describes it as achzariyut, to say that like people are suffering just because that's the way of the world. It's cruel. It's cruel to say that my hands didn't spill this blood. There's a cruelty to that because you're not taking responsibility. And so while I am aware of the morass and the paralysis that comes with A, thinking like it all revolves around individual decisions, or B, that it's all my fault, or C, well, then I can't do anything to change it, those caveats should not prevent us from taking a very clear look in the mirror. All right. Good. So we'll continue. Many of us assume that the world is stable. That's actually an old Aristotelian trope. Many of us don't necessarily know that about the world having pre-existed according to a certain set of rules. Maimonides is a good example of someone who grapples with that in the Guide of the Perplexed. He said, I'm kind of glad that Aristotle, this is somewhat of a paraphrase, I'm glad that Aristotle didn't prove that the world really was pre-existent, that it had always been here, because then we would have had a hard time reimagining the book of Genesis, but we could have done it. There's a whole stream of other thinkers, however, who just totally reject the Aristotelian understanding and say, no, God created the world and God can destroy the world. One of the great examples of this is a book that no one reads. It's from Moshe Isserles, who is a 16th century rabbi known for his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which most Ashkenazi Jews follow. This is the Ramah, whose Mapa on the Shulchan Aruch set the stage for Ashkenazi Judaism. He has this other book called Torah Ta'olah, which is about the sacrifices. It's about the laws of the sacrifices and about meditating on the sacrifices as a practice. The most important theme of that book is the fact that the world can come to an end. And it's about religious praxis and religious contemplation at the edge of catastrophe. For him, it wasn't about human deeds. It was about the fact that the world is born for a certain period of time and will exit at a certain period of time. However, I think that provides a typology for thinking about a world that is not as stable as the Aristotelians would like us to believe. Climate philosophers have begun talking in the past 15 years about the interruption of Gaia. Gaia as a force, the kind of world that will, if not in a kind of cognizant way, which might be kind of silly, will kick, as it were, as a response to over-extraction, to fracking, to industrial agriculture, and all sorts of other things. That got me thinking about something that I had noticed a while ago, which is that there's this amazing section of Jewish thought which understands that land is not an object, but a subject. So if you look at the book of Exodus and the chapters about Shemitah, it's all about human commerce. If you look at the book of Leviticus, first of all, if you look at the book of Leviticus, the land is alive. It has Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, it's the land that flows with milk and honey. It has bodily fluids. It has agency. It's a thing, not independent of God. God commands and the land acts. That's Leviticus. So what you find in these sources is that the land is the one that rests. Shavta ha'aretz. The land is literally, it's the subject of the sentence, not the object. You find this throughout the book of Leviticus in different ways. The land is the actor. The land is appeased when it kicks us off after we haven't at the end in the curses of the book of Leviticus toward the end. Once we've been kicked off the land and we're not able to live there anymore, the land will heal itself. The land, tirtza ha'aretz, et shabtotea, it will take its Sabbaths, its shmitot. It will find its right, even if we are not there. A 20th century, died in 2000, 20th century Hasidic philosopher and leader, the Netivot Shalom Noach Bar Mishkovsky, who is very popular these days, both because he was brilliant and because he wrote in modern Hebrew, so it's great. And he was close to the Musar world, so if you like Musar, but you don't love Chassidut, this is the book for you. He's also an amazing thinker. I would never have seen this if I hadn't been thinking about this, but he has this amazing discussion of the Mabul, of the flood, as what he calls hashlacha, a consequence. And so he says, why is it that in those psukim, in the verses about the flood, it's all passive and God isn't doing anything? So he says as follows, like there's lots of different ways that God can punish, right? The Hebrew Bible is filled with that. But the worst of them of all is the bechina of hashlacha, the sort of quality of consequence. Why? Because God's removed God's self from that picture. Providence has been removed. It happens on its own. I find that to be an interesting and tremendously powerful way of thinking about what happens when processes are set into motion. That cannot easily be stopped. Now, what are we supposed to do? I think the first thing that Judaism calls us to do is to take responsibility. There are many different versions of this midrash that you have in front of you, in which God shows Adam, the first human beings, the garden that has been created, and says, don't mess it up. No one's going to come after you to heal it. There are many different versions of that. This, I understand to be a central focal point of what a Jewish environmental ethic is. And in this, I think that the anthropocentric focus of Judaism is a feature, not a bug, in this current moment. People argue about when the Anthropocene, this age that we're in, starts. Maybe it was 1492, maybe it was the first industrial revolution, maybe it was the second industrial revolution, maybe it's the post-war atomic age, who knows? But the Anthropocene, meaning the time in which human beings are able to fundamentally shift their own life and the life of everything else on this planet, is a fact. If that's true, religion has something very important to bring to the table. It demands that we take responsibility for our actions. But we exist within a greater community. Here's another source that I almost fell down when I read it for the first time. It's actually from a 19th century Hasidic thinker, and I can't prove this to you, but he lived in Poland in the second half of the 20th century. I have a feeling that he saw the devastation of the Polish forests before the railroad. I have a sense that he watched the processes of industrialization there in Silesia, the coal mines and things like that, because this has this amazing understanding of what happens when human beings run amok. And he says as follows, Na'aseh ha'adam b'tzalmeinu k'demutenu. When God says we're going to make the human beings in our image, I think if you woke someone up at night and asked them, why is that in the plural? They would say, I don't know, maybe it's the royal we. Maybe it's because God asked the angels, which is that classic midrash. Maybe there are other answers, I don't know. So the way that this Hasidic thinker, Rabbi Yaakov Lehner, reads it is as follows. God asks all other created beings, should I create human beings? There, and so the Midrash actually says this, that every animal, every creation is asked, do you want to be created? And they evidently all said yes. I guess all the ones we know about. Who knows about the ones that said no? But they all said yes. But no one was asked about the others. Comes the human being, and God has to ask everyone else. Why? Because of what it says toward the end. Yesh lo b'chira uvakil kulo yachol lekalkel gam et shar habruim. Human beings have a different quality of free choice, and with that choice misapplied through their destruction, they can ruin it all. But we're here. Sometimes when I teach this text, people say, yeah, that's what a human source would say. Of course we're here. Okay, fine. It's an anthropocentric text. I get it. But it means that we live with a fundamental obligation and responsibility that is pre-ontological. Yeah, meaning it's before we came into this world. Our obligation toward the other here, capital O, lowercase o, to the world around us, is not an afterthought. It's not noblesse oblige. It's not because we are the high point of creation. It's because we owe our existence to that. It's with that source in mind that I read the famous story that gives us at least many of the Divrei Torah about Tu B'Shvat, about the rabbi who encounters the tree. And it says, Ilan, Ilan, Bama avarechacha. How can I bless you? And he goes through all the different things that he thinks a tree should want. And then he says, the only thing that I can bless you with is that I hope that the trees that come forth from you are like you. All the research that's been done on trees in the past 15 years, maybe more, suggests that what we saw earlier, remember Zelda talking about tree interiority? Turns out that it's kind of a thing. And they communicate, and it doesn't look like human communication. It doesn't look anything like that. But trees have their own world. There's actually amazing passages in the Yerushalmi that say exactly this. Trees have their own kind of, as my friend Alex Weisberg describes it, vegetative interiority. And so what do you do when you encounter a tree? It's like the opposite of the giving tree, that horrible story that we all love and grew up with. At least I did. I don't think you can get it anymore. Here you just bless the tree, that it should lean into its treeness. If you'd like another version of this, look at the opening passages from Martin Buber's I and Thou. What is his best description of how do you encounter another being? It's encountering a tree. Not as my projection, not as anything else, but as encountering the tree qua tree on its own terms. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, has a description of how necessary it is to learn the songs from the animals around us and the plants around us, not just their scientific names. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav had a similar notion of living in community before Naomi Shemer created a beautiful song based on this, which is that thinking with that previous source from the Beit Yosef, from Rabbi Yaakov Lehner, it is that the shepherd learns the song of life, of his life, of her life, from the animals and land across which they wander. Here too, like in that previous source, it's all about reciprocity. The shepherd learns the song of the place, giving it back through the arc of melody, such that there is food for the animals to eat. Okay. See if there's a chat that's come in. Just a second. Yeah, great, Sarah. I'm going to leave you with a few thoughts. One is that as we come farther and farther down, Judaism has a great normative language for thinking about obligation. American law is built on rights. This is not my insight. This is Robert Covert's insight and many others. American law is built on rights. Jewish law is built on obligations. An overarching ethos of responsibility toward people and toward the things around us It's not, as Maimonides will say, just here for our pleasure. Everything has its own purpose. Everything has its own being. As you go through these sources, I invite you to consider these three categories. Well, they're called Avot Nizikin, or two of them are Avot Nizikin and one of them is something else. But essentially they're examples plucked from the world of ancient tort law, the laws of damages. One has to do with fire, which I apply to, meaning fire damage, which applies to everything that is both movable and its damage causing potential is foreseeable. The second, bore, pits, are non-movable, stationary things that this category counts for both cumulative damage. It talks about people who dig pits on the bottom of pits, which seems like a really dumb thing until you think about what happens when you are the generation that pushes the environment past 350 parts per million or 450 parts per million. And then everyone wrings their hands and tries to figure out, well, who's responsible? Turns out we have a language for cumulative damage, as well as what's called slow damage, things that happen over time, and multiple causality. These are things that modern and contemporary law hasn't even begun to figure out. And the other category is the laws of neighborly relations. Essentially, it is a clear prohibition against externalizing damage to the other, whether that's an animal or whether it's a person or whether it's something else, as the cost of doing business. The formal prohibitions about where you can and cannot put things in certain places means that there are long-standing and fundamental ways of rethinking where I can and cannot do my business at the cost because of the cost that other people must pay. My dear friend and colleague, Chagai Reznikov, has been thinking about many of these issues from the perspective of sakana, from the perspective of danger. I recently have been thinking about them from the perspective of hashavat aveda, of the mitzvah to return things to people. When I taught a class on that, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, I stumbled upon the fact that when hashavat aveda gets expanded in the rabbinic sources, it also applies to returning someone's body to them or their land and things like that. And I was like, oh, wow, it's so dumb. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I woke up one night, literally, and thought, wow, now I have a way of thinking about climate change and its implications for other people and whether or not, and as it says here, you're required to go out and hire someone to prevent someone's field from being flooded. And I'm reading this, and there are countries that are going underwater. Okay, now we're beginning to start building a normative language. I'm going to skip over this. You can enjoy that. And I'm going to close here. There's a point to all these laws, and also to the fact that there are some that are not spelled out explicitly. The Midchat Asher, who was a contemporary posek, has an amazing innovation that I'm not even sure he understands how radical it is. He says that there are 11 places in the Rishonim, in the early rabbinic sages, meaning the medievals, as to why it's not permitted to cause suffering to animals. Tsar Balei Chaim. All right, that's awesome. There are 11. If there are 11 reasons, it means no one has any idea why. And he makes the following point. It doesn't matter which reason is the right one. It matters because that's the will of the Torah. God wanted it to be that, and the rabbis will figure it out. God obviously doesn't want us to be cruel. What happens if we begin to extend this principle to allow us and to force us and to make us think about what halacha, this language of Judaism that is in deep within our bones, that drives the way that we understand our obligations to God, to other human beings, and to the world around us, that becomes a force for preserving the richness of this planet. Ritzon HaTorah, that it is God's will, the will of the Torah, that we make that happen. So from amid fracturing comes flourishing. Sometimes we need the brokenness and the experience of that in order to be able to rise up and to reconfigure our ways of being. We need halacha, we need agada, and we also need each other. To be rooted in a place is to see one's children and grandchildren inhabiting that place. Maybe that's Westchester. Maybe that's Eretz Israel. It's certainly the earth. Just one second. We all know God. We visit the sick because God visits the sick. We do lots of things because God does them. One of the things that I think we are less schooled on in that particular mode of thinking is that imitatio Dei, following in God's ways, is also the art of tree planting. Just as God plants trees, we are called to plant trees. But the example there is when you go into the land of Israel. But the proof is because God, the first thing God does when God creates a garden is plant trees. So it's a universal story as also a local story. The Midrash says, do as God does, plant trees. So let us plant trees, but let us not do that not only by putting roots in the ground, but by putting our roots in the ground. Let us seek new old myths. Let us take responsibility for our actions, and let us turn to the deep wells of tradition to create that more verdant tomorrow.
Ariel, thank you so much. I wanted to open it up to questions. If people want to use the raise hand function, if you want to put the question in the chat. I got a couple of private chat questions, but I also want to give folks a chance to speak up. So I'll give everybody a minute or so. Okay, so Ariel, one question that came up was it was two questions that I'm going to fold into one. One question that came up was the verse in Genesis in the context of the creation of human beings, that human beings have a mission to subdue the earth. And how do you read that? And another question, which I think is adjacent to that one, is so much of the destructive technology also has a positive side to it and is life enabling. And how do we reckon with that to retreat from technology might also mean a diminishing of not of human flourishing, of human life. It might mean retreating from, let's say, medical advances and things like that. So I think those two questions are both pushing back or questioning the positive role of technology, even at the expense of, let's say, climate change.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for those questions. I'll take the second one first, and then I'll move to the first one. I don't in any way endorse retreating from technology. I think that technology is tremendous. The advances in what it has given us and what it has been enabled us to do in the medical field and in many others are irretrievably wonderful. On the other hand, what frightens me more is the assumption of a kind of technological mindset in which every question can be reduced to a question of technology and every answer can be reduced to an answer of technology. I have the same issue with scientism and as a kind of ideology that moves religion, ethics, and all sorts of other questions off the table. And so while all technologies should be on the table, the fact that America can, at least in the short run, continue running on coal does not mean that it ought to. And there are reasons, the fact that Judaism has this robust tradition of how to think about air pollution and smoke and things like that would push us to think about that in a different direction. Understanding that that particular category of technology is very different than others. The whole question of terraforming of climate engineering and things like that is one that Jewish thinkers have only begun to think about, but like we've been thinking about technology for a very long time. Let's look at the way that Jews get freaked out over matzah. Machine-made matzah, not machine-made matzah. Machine-made matzah is better, machine-made matzah is the worst, all these sorts of things. Like we've been thinking about this in all sorts of ways. And I think it is time for us to be exerting the kind of mental energy necessary to think about these particular questions. When one engages in a constructive project like this, now I'll move to the first question. One chooses which verses and which thrusts within the tradition to lift up. There was a great scholar of the name of American law by the name of Llewellyn, who describes American common law as a canon that parries and thrusts. And what is not important is the sort of framing intention, but rather the meaning that can be hewn out of it at any particular moment. I've always found that to be a very beautiful way of thinking about the way in which anything in Judaism, from the Hebrew Bible to the Talmud and on, contains it and its opposite. Is there a thrust within the Hebrew Bible that asserts human domination? Yes, although I thought that a lot more until I read Ellen Davis's book, who is a Christian theologian who spends a lot of time with the Old Testament, called An Agrarian Reading of the Bible. One of the great themes of the Hebrew Bible, and you find this from Genesis to Chronicles, is the fragility of our relationship with the world and the land. It's a deep relationship, but it's also a fragile relationship, because the ancient Israelites, and this is deep into the history of the biblical imagination, lived in a world without irrigation. They lived in a world without irrigation. They lived in a world that depended entirely on rainfall. And as so, they were not the masters of their own destiny. So you might say that those chapters, those openings in the first chapter of Genesis about dominate the world and subdue it, are undone by the verse Le'ovda Uleshomra, that we've been placed into this world. I mean, we don't ever worship the land. We don't ever serve the land. That word doesn't ever really occur in that way in the Hebrew Bible. So you might better translate it. This is what Ellen Davis says. That is best understood as make yourself a servant to the one who had created the land, and exist within that world of keeping it and guarding it and safeguarding it. And here I will use that word that I maligned at the very beginning, of becoming a steward for it. And so those thrusts within our tradition, or those values within our tradition, exist at a particular moment and in conversation with one another. And in order to confront the contemporary moment, and this is part of what happens when you take a tradition that is incredibly rich and bring it into contemporary questions, is you always have to choose which are those sections that allow us to create the contemporary moment. I sometimes I say this, and I think that I'm overstating the case, but I don't think so. That I think that we're in a moment similar to what happened in the medieval world with the discovery of Aristotelianism, where people were like, oh my gosh, there's this amazing thing called Greek philosophy and this guy named Aristotle. Let's do everything all over. Not in the sense of doing it all over, but in the sense of we need to rethink things. Scholars of American law call that a constitutional moment, something so strange, so unprecedented that we have to rethink things. I think that the current moment is one of those. It's a constitutional moment within the religious tradition. And that requires boldness. But it's the same thing that Jews have been doing forever. It's like, that's what Rabbinic Judaism is. Rabbinic Judaism is born of the crucible of the destruction of the temple. Rabbinic Judaism has that, and it's not a feature, not a bug, it's a feature. It's baked into the cake. That's what Jewish hermeneutical traditions are. That was a long answer for two very good questions.
Thank you. Ariel, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody here for joining. And I just want to reiterate, with your permission, Ariel, that if you have follow-up questions, you can feel free to reach out to Ariel. And I should have said at the outset that this was meant to be in honor of Tu B'Shvat, but we things like COVID got in the way. But I'm happy that you brought that up, because this is retro B'Shvat. So thanks everybody, Erev Tov, and hope to see everybody again soon. Take care, and thank you again, Ariel.
Thank you all so much. I've put my email in the chat. Please be in touch if you'd like to. If you have any questions, I tried to send out the sources. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work, but perhaps there's also a way to send it out to all the registrants. And if you can't find it, I'm not that impossible to find. Send me an email and I'll send you the sources, and I'm always happy to talk about them. Please learn them with someone that you love.
Thanks again, everybody.